Welcome back to episode 2 of Horror Highlights. Why did I do that? Cute. Film number 1, The Transfiguration. This is a 2016 American indie horror directed and written by Michael O'Sheen, his feature-length debut, and follows the story of Milo, a young boy with an obsession with vampires and maybe some vampiric tendencies, growing up in a rough neighborhood. He's an orphan and he lives with his brother, and he forms a friendship with another young girl, Sophie, and it's about the two of them growing up in this rough area, and they're both from very troubled backgrounds, and yeah, it's just a story of their friendship. And Milo's also low-key a vampire, kinda, sort of. I'm a sucker for these sorts of films, if you pardon the pun, as this is a coming-of-age story with horror aspects thrown in there, which I consider raw to be a film like that. And I really like films like this. This was submitted to the Cannes Film Festival on a whim by Michael O'Sheen, and he got in, so it's quite inspiring to see just a first-time filmmaker get into Cannes on a whim. And watching this film, this is clearly made by someone who's got a big passion for horror cinema. There's a lot of references to other great vampire films, particularly Nosferatu, as you can see in the marketing of it, but also they go to see at one point Nosferatu in the film. It's a very good, quiet character study. This is a very slow film. I mean, for a vampire film, this is probably one of the slowest I've seen, but it takes its time with the characters of Milo and Sophie well. They're both quite shy and introverted and have got a lot of emotional baggage, and the scenes between them are really good. They sort of capture this awkward anxiety they both have, because they're both quite odd personalities because of their traumatic past, and they're just looking for anyone to connect with in this rough world that they inhabit. They're both orphaned, and so the interactions between the two of them are the main hook of the film. A lot of the time they spend discussing Milo's obsession with vampires, which Sophie just thinks is a little quirky interest he has, and they talk about this at length because both of them are just eager to connect on any topic. So it's quite a tender, well scripted character dynamic between the two of them. The film also raises some interesting ideas on vampirism. I mean, vampires have been on film for ages, so it's hard to have a sort of a fresh take on them. This film has a solid attempt at it. Milo watches videos of animals being killed. He also plans out when he's going to kill someone and drink their blood in a calendar. So sort of that aspect of watching violence and then sort of a monthly need to fulfill this thing, it sort of makes allusions towards porn or like sexual development, which is quite an interesting idea, but the film doesn't really explore that theme much more. It sort of raises it and then doesn't really do much of it. The theme that the film then moves on to, which was quite interesting, is morality, and sort of it studies how a vampire would suffer with the moral issue of having to kill for survival. And the film explores this topic in quite an interesting way in the final act, with an ending that I thought was very strong, although the film script is a bit annoying in this way that There's exposition at the very end of the film, which sort of explains the theme and message of the film, which isn't necessary. I quite like films that trust the audience and trust them to pay attention and to piece things together themselves. And so when a film at the end goes, by the way, this is what I was trying to say, look, this is what links it all together. I'm a bit like, yeah, we got it. You didn't have to spell it out, like leave some ambiguity to the filmmaking. While the character drama is good and engaging, it wasn't strong enough to carry the whole film for me, and the film does end up being quite forgettable because there's just not many set pieces. It explores the ideas and themes of being a vampire, but it doesn't really have many set pieces or thrilling or chilling aspects to it. There are some interesting flashes of quite gory violence, but they're few and far between. And sort of because the characters that you're watching are so restrained and introverted, it's sort of a very quiet, atmospheric film, and it just wasn't quite strong enough in its writing to make up for the sort of to be entertaining enough to overcome this sort of slow burn, ponderous atmosphere it creates. So yeah, interesting themes and ideas, but just if I'm being totally honest, it was just a bit dull. And you need your horror films to be scary and exciting. Like, come on. Film number 2, Pulse. And this is a 2001 Japanese horror film about... Not really sure what it's about. There's some ghosts, and there's the internet, and a bunch of stuff happens. And some of it's really, really creepy. No, but essentially what the film is about is two groups of people have some strange occurrences happen on the internet to them, and they are confused and sort of try and dig deeper and try and understand what's going on. And it sort of comes to fore that spirits may be trying to enter our world via the internet. Yeah. And then the film goes completely off the deep end in the third act, but we'll get to that. It's quite interesting that this film tries to make the topic of the internet scary, as this was made in 2001. So like the internet was nowhere near as prevalent or advanced as it is now, but yet these filmmakers sensed something was odd or weird about it and went, you know what, let's try and make a horror film about this. Recently, this topic has been the subject of many horror films, with like Unfriended being one of them. And I haven't seen any of these sort of internet horrors because the idea of the internet being scary, like for a horror film, doesn't really work for me. Like the idea of people watching their screens and then you're going to see something move in the background of the webcam footage, it just doesn't seem like an engaging topic to me. But this film has some really, really good set pieces with the internet and really clever filmmaking. This film has some of the best horror set pieces and thrilling sequences I've seen in a long time. There's one particular scene in a basement that scared the shit out of me. It's so well done. The film has so many great ideas for set pieces, for using the internet or shot angles in a creative way, and it's one of those great horror films that's got specific images in it that really stick with you long after. It's not a loud horror film, it doesn't use jump scares particularly, but it's got very clever camera movements and uses of space and lighting. The use of lighting in this film is phenomenal. There are scenes in this film that just make me grin thinking about them because they are just so effective in scaring you. I think if it wasn't for those brilliant horror set pieces, this film wouldn't be that good at all. The first two acts of this horror film are really, really strong as it sets up the intrigue of these ghosts or entities that are trying to communicate via the internet, and then the people investigating and learning more. It makes for a really strong sort of mystery. And then along the way, it explores some interesting ideas about how isolated people can be and how the internet doesn't really work. That's quite an obvious idea to explore, but this film does it well through the shot composition and everyone seeming quite distant, and everyone being positioned like being shot with like a window behind them or in like cubicles. It's some really good direction. And then also the some character dynamics explore some quite mature themes. There's two characters who discuss and struggle with existential dread quite a lot, and what everything means and what happens after death, and how the internet isn't really that comforting when it comes to those sorts of fears. And so the film does explore some bigger themes, whilst also having these great set pieces. The third act of this film, however, is a letdown. The It goes off the rails quite quickly. There's sort of a lot of ambiguity, and a lot of questions that are unanswered as the third act comes into play. And these questions sort of remain unanswered, and the film divulges into such insanity very quickly, and you're sort of left going, what? Did I miss a bit of dialogue? Was there a scene that was meant to explain something to me? Because the end of this film, the stakes ramp up and everything becomes so dramatic, and you're sort of like, this is feels completely different to the film I've been watching for the last hour and a half. I don't want to get into spoilers too much about what happens, but the ending of this film reminded me of the ending of Ringu, in how the ending of both of these films are very similar in you're sort of following the story, one storyline, and then it gets a lot more dramatic towards the end. And both the endings are similar for a specific reason, and I don't know whether that's because of something in Japanese culture around ghosts means that this event has to happen. Try not to give anything away here, but both films are quite similar in how they end. And so it's interesting, but also it seemed way too dramatic. Also, as the film moves into the third act and the ghosts become more frequently seen, the film's budget does become an issue, as the special effects in this film are really quite poor, and poor for like 2001 standards. So there's quite long sequences with ghosts or with CGI, and it does take you out of the experience. And it's interesting because the first half of the film has some really scary sequences which don't really rely on extensive CGI. So the third act of this film was very confusing and disappointing, because it sort of just didn't undo everything else that had happened, but seemed so out of touch with the first two acts and the great horror set pieces and interesting themes that had occurred. Having said that, I don't think that necessarily ruins the whole film. This is a film that you do think about afterwards, whether it be for just remembering those really eerie sequences that I talked about, but also it does have some interesting things to say about the internet. So yeah, it's a mixed bag, let down a lot by its budget and final act, but this is still a very strong horror film exploring the internet, and it's amazing that this film was made when it was nearly, well, 20 years ago now. And finally, film number 3, The Hills Have Eyes, Wes Craven's 1977 horror film. Wes Craven, the very famous horror director, made this film. This was his third feature film, after his first being The Last House on the Left, which I didn't know. So the guy made Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Scream, all of which became horror franchises with his help in the future. So, guy's pretty good at making horror films, but he's most famous for A Nightmare on Elm Street, obviously, and Scream. And he made this film much earlier in his career, in 1977. It would be another 5 or 6 years, I think, before he made The Nightmare on Elm Street, and he didn't make Scream till into the 90s. So he was still honing his craft, I think, as a horror director. And this film tells the story of the Carter family, who are on a family vacation on their way to California, and they're driving through the desert to reach there, and they decide to make a pit stop in this remote area to visit a old silver mine that used to be owned by their family. And of course, once they go out there, things go wrong, like the car breaks down, and they realize they're not alone in the desert. So it's pretty conventional horror setup. When you watch horror films that are like older, you're a bit like, oh, this is going to be a bit tame. It's not going to be that scary or violent. But with this film, I was surprised at how nasty and horrible it is. It made me look up what other horror films had come out recently to sort of get a feel for what the threshold was on how nasty horror films could be. The Exorcist had already come out, so there was people had seen a lot more violent stuff than this film, and Alien would come out 2 years later. So I was sort of like, oh, okay, they can have a really horrible film in the 70s. Okay, fair enough. Because this film is dark. It's very dark and violent and gritty and quite mean-spirited. You're probably aware or can tell from the publicity stuff of this film. Essentially, they get stuck out in the desert, and then cannibal inbreds start attacking them, and violence and chaos ensues. And I have to say, I was surprised at how violent the film got and how threatening it was towards the female characters. And there's a child in the family as well, and how sort of threatening and violent the film is towards the child. It got under your skin in that way. The film isn't particularly gory, apart from a few sequences that have some cool practical effects, but the film is just quite vulgar and threatening. It does create a good sense of anxiety and fear that reflects what the characters, this family, are feeling. And the film does do a lot with its location. This is quite a small budget film, and it's all set in one location. And so when the film was starting, I'm like, this could be quite a drag, because it's just set in a desert, and there's a car, and there's a camper van, and there's some caves, and that's it. And so when the film was starting, I was like, what are they really going to be able to do with this location, in the terms of it's hard to film thrilling sequences here because it's just nothing. It's just desert and a couple of vehicles. But Wes Craven crafts some really thrilling and exciting sequences in this, and he uses the small location he has to its fullest effect. And it's interesting to see, because Scream, for example, has just such a great opening sequence that builds such tension. It's really great to see where he started and sort of then think, wow, it's no surprise you could craft such amazing horror sequences in Scream and A Nightmare on Elm Street, because he was able to make such a thrilling film here with such limited resources. What has been discussed quite a lot, but is worth mentioning, is the class commentary this film has. So you've got a very sort of middle class family. The father of the family is a retired police officer, and they're all on their way to California, which is like sort of the most stereotypical luxurious place in America. And they're stopping in like sort of this place that implies the South and poverty and sort of hillbillies. The area where they do stop is being used for military testing as well. And so the film sort of sets up this dynamic of the middle class versus the lower class being represented crudely by the cannibals. And the film is interesting for how it presents this middle class family early on as very pampered and very privileged and quite rude and obnoxious. They don't pay attention to the local work of the gas station that warns them about going. They they have full confidence in themselves and that they will prevail because they're the moral, religious middle class, and they won't be deterred by any lower class. And so you sort of don't like some members of the family early on. And so it's it's not that the film punishes them for being middle class or being privileged, but it just creates an interesting commentary and sort of a reality check for that privileged family. People have analysed this film for its class commentary quite a bit. I don't think the film's necessarily as smart as other people have made it out to be. I think what the film is trying to do, as far as its class dynamic, is just sort of say, hey, privileged people, you're just as vulnerable and just as human as people from other classes. And by the end of the film, some of the members of this family are reduced to the same barbaric, violent behavior as the hillbillies, and sort of it breaks their humanity down throughout the course of the film. And so the film sort of says that these privileged people are just as capable of brutality and violence despite their wealth and higher level of education. They're still human, and humans are always capable of abhorrent violence. So, for a film that on the surface looks very dumb and very lackluster, I mean, it's about a family being attacked by cannibals in the desert. It's very well made and does have some interesting ideas, but I think the main takeaway is just how exciting and scary and thrilling the set pieces are, and the war that happens between these two families in the desert. It has to be said, when watching this, you sort of have to put aside your sense of political correctness and gender politics, because the women in this film aren't presented or treated particularly well, and neither are the children. It's sort of a film where everyone's presented in a negative way and are all treated abhorrently, and so you sort of just have to put that to the side and enjoy the horrible spectacle that's going on. It doesn't glorify anything that happens in the film, it's just some pretty horrible stuff happens to women in this film. Purely on the basis of good horror filmmaking in the sense of action and suspenseful sequences, this is a great film, and I always like seeing a filmmaker do great work early in their career with little budget. This film doesn't have a lot of money behind it, but Wes Craven was able to craft some brilliant sequences with what he had. Sometimes the budget does show with like the makeup and prosthetics of the hillbillies, but for the most part, this is just a very fun, violent, entertaining film.